In this video, you're going to learn about the second way you can create React components, and this is the stateless functional component. It's an alternative to our class-based components. Now, we're not going to be using just one or just the other. Instead, we're going to be using a combination of the two. Now, I do want to take just a quick second to write out those words. Stateless functional component, because the stateless functional component, it is indeed all three of these. It is a React component, just like our class-based components. It is also just a function, unlike our class-based components. And finally, it is stateless. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be using a combination of the two. So some of the components we've already created are going to stay class-based components, but some aren't. So indecision app, that one manages some state. We are going to leave it as a class-based component because this new component, although we don't know how to create it yet, doesn't allow for state. But if we look down below, we're going to see that a majority of our components are very simple. Header, for example, just gets some information passed to it, and it renders that information to the screen. This could easily be converted over to a stateless functional component because look at it. It is just a single function render. It just happens to be on a class. What we're going to be able to do is simplify components like this, components like action, options, and option. These are all very simple presentational components. That means they're concerned with just the presentation of information. They're not concerned with managing complex state. Sure, some of them do have event handlers, but they don't care about what happens when that method gets called. All they know is they need to call a method. So these components are very simple and very stupid, and that is great. These should make up a majority of our application, and we should have state condensed into just a few places. So we know that some of these are great candidates for stateless functional components. We know that some, like add option, aren't. They use state. Before we go ahead and talk any more about our existing components, let's just go ahead and take a look at this brand new syntax, and we're going to do that down below. So right here, all we're going to do is we're going to make a constant, and we're going to give this constant a name. This name is going to end up being the component name. So we want to follow the exact same naming conventions we've used for our components so far. We want to start with an uppercase first letter. I'm going to create a user component that renders some user information to the screen. Now, as I mentioned, stateless functional components are just functions, so we're going to set this equal to a function. We could use a regular function with the function keyword, but I'm going to go ahead and use an arrow function. You can use either. It just needs to be a function. Excellent. Now, this function is very similar to the class component's render method. So inside of render, what happens? It gets called behind the scenes, and whatever comes back is what actually gets shown to the screen. And the exact same thing is true for this function. So if we have a simple class-based component like this one, which is just a method that returns some JSX, all we have to do to convert it to a stateless functional component is just return the JSX in here. So for user, I'm going to return inside of parentheses a div, and we'll toss some stuff inside of this div. For the user, let's say we are going to show their name and age in a little profile widget. So I'll set up a couple of p tags for that. The first one can be for the name colon space, and we'll worry about getting the name later. And the second one will be for the age. Right here, age colon space. We'll close off that p tag. Excellent. So what do we have? We have a completely valid stateless functional component. And we can actually go ahead and render it to the screen the same way we've rendered our class-based components. So down here, we render an instance of indecision app. Inside of indecision app, way up at the top, we render header, action, options, add option. We're going to use the exact same technique to render our stateless functional components. To prove that, I'm just going to take the name down below, leaving everything else in place. I'm going to delete the name and replace it with uppercase U user. Now, if we go ahead and save app.js, the browser is going to refresh in the background, and we should be able to take a peek at what happens. And right here, we are getting what we would expect. We are getting the div with two paragraph tags. The first one is name, and the second one is age. So there we have it. We've successfully created and rendered our very first stateless functional component. Now, these functional components obviously don't manage state. It's in the name, but they do still allow for props, which is great. That means we can still pass information in, whether it's static data to show to the screen or whether it's a function to have called based off of some user interaction. To do that, we just pass in the prop like we would for a class-based component. For example, I can set name equal to Andrew, And then I can access the name prop, putting it right here inside of the paragraph tag. Now, your stateless functional components do not have access to this. Obviously, our arrow functions do not either. So how exactly do we get the props? Well, the props get passed in to this function as the first argument. So we can name that props, and this is exactly the same as this dot props in your class-based components. So it's an object with all of the key value pairs. In this case, we just have one key, name. So right here, I'll create a JavaScript expression that would be props.name. If this was a class-based component, it would be this dot props.name. But if we go ahead and actually render props.name to the screen, we can see what happens. I'm going to save the file, and right here, Andrew shows up. We can do the exact same thing for age. I'm going to take age and set it equal to my age. Then I'm going to render it right here inside of a JavaScript expression, props.age. Save the file, the app refreshes, and once again, we are getting our information showing to the screen. So while we cannot use state inside of our stateless functional components, we can indeed use props, and that makes these really, really handy. Now, when it comes to advantages, there are quite a few for stateless functional components. First up, they are faster than our class-based components. So when we can, we should be using them. They're faster because they don't come with all of the overhead and baggage of being a class and having to extend React.component. There's a lot of code in there that we're not taking advantage of. For example, code that allows us to manage the state. If we have a very simple presentational component, we can just use a function. React calls that function, it gets the JSX back, and it renders it. There is no overhead. Now, in my opinion, they're also a little bit easier to read and write. And finally, as we'll prove later, they are much easier to test. But let's not worry about any of that. What I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about is exactly what's happening right here. Now, we know that when we use a lowercase letter in JSX, it is going to assume we're creating an HTML element. We know when we're using an uppercase letter, it is going to look for a variable in scope, and it is going to actually reference that in the React.createElement call. We already saw this with our class-based components, and the same thing is true with our stateless functional components. So if we crack open app.js and we scroll way to the bottom of the file, we're going to see our React DOM.render call. Down here, right here, we have the compiled version of that JSX. It is just a React.createElement call, and we reference user. User is just a function. So now we know that React.createElement takes a string for HTML. It can also take a variable. That variable can be a class that extends React.component, or it can just be a function. React knows how to handle all of that stuff, including our stateless functional components. Now that we've created our very own stateless functional component, let's go ahead and actually convert some of our class-based components over to stateless functional components. I'm going to kick things off by just commenting out this code right here, although I will leave it in place so you can use it as a reference. And down below, instead of rendering user, I'm going to switch us back to the indecision app component. Now this should bring our app up to the screen once again, and the goal is to take some of these four components and actually convert them over. So we have option, we have options, we have action, and we have header. Let's go ahead and convert action together. So the process of converting a class-based component to a stateless functional component is actually pretty easy. Step one is to create a new const with the exact same name. Uppercase A action, I'm going to set it equal to a function. Excellent. Now remember, this function is basically the equivalent of render. So we can take all of the stuff from inside of render, copy it, and just directly paste it right inside of that function. This is perfectly valid. Now obviously, some stuff needs to change. What needs to change? Well, we no longer have access to this. So you do want to make a quick scan through your JSX to ensure you're not using this anywhere. In this case, we have this.props.handlePick. We are now going to have access to props via the first argument, which means that we can remove this dot and just access props.handlePick directly. And the same thing is going to be true down below for props.hasOptions. Now we actually don't need to make any changes to where this is initialized. That can stay exactly the same. We literally just need to change the definition of the class. If I go ahead and comment out the class-based component, leaving the stateless functional one in place, we can save the file and check our work. Right here, we have our action. It is disabled, which is good. If I add an item, we can see it becomes enabled. And if I click it, we can see that it is still correctly getting everything showing to the screen. So switching really is not bad. If you already have a class-based component that just has a render method, you're essentially just copying and pasting the returned JSX and making a few minor tweaks. Now that we've done this once together, it is going to be your challenge to do it for the other 3 components. So we just went through this process. We converted the action class over to the action stateless functional component. All of those 3, option, options, and header, they are also great candidates. So what I want you to do is go down one at a time, converting these over to stateless functional components. Do one at a time and test your work as you go. If you do run into any errors, it's going to be way easier to know that it is a specific one because you did them one at a time, as opposed to getting to the end and having to figure out which of the 3 is causing the problem. So take some time, pause the video, knock this one out, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? We're going to go ahead and kick things off with header. Step 1 is to create a const that matches the name. Then we're going to set it equal to a function. And then we're going to take everything from render and copy and paste it. I'm going to grab this stuff. I'm going to put it right inside of there. And then we're just going to make a few tweaks. The first tweak is the fact that this doesn't exist. And the second one is the fact that it gets passed in props via that first argument. So we're going to set that up. And then we're going to remove this dot in both locations. And there we have it. We now have a stateless functional component for header as opposed to a class-based component. Now I am going to test my work by saving app.js. The header is still showing up, so we can move on to the next one, which is options. And we're going to follow those exact same steps. Const options. We set it equal to a function. This function returns the JSX. We already have all of that defined, so we can just copy and paste it. Now when we do copy and paste it, we got to make those tweaks. We're going to set up props. We're going to remove this dot props, replacing it with just the reference to props. Nothing else needs to change inside of options. We can go ahead and remove the options class, save our work, and ensure that everything still renders. A, B, C. There we go. All of the items are still showing up. Next up, down below, we are going to tweak option. So option is still a class-based component. We're going to make the const option. We're going to set up our function where the props get passed in. Inside of the function, we're just going to return the JSX we already have defined. Once we do that, we just tweak this dot props to props. We remove the class definition, save the file, and there we have it. We are done. Over here, we should still see the individual options. Let's see if we do. A, B, C. They're all shown up correctly, which means that everything is indeed working. I can remove them, they all go away, and the application is still working as expected. So there we have it. We've converted 4 out of our 6 components over to stateless functional components, and this means that our application is just a little bit faster and a little bit easier to work with. Now, we do still have some class-based components, and that's fine. These two can and should live alongside one another. If we do need some of the advanced features like state, that's cool. Use a class-based component. If you don't and you find yourself creating a class that just has a render method, it's probably best to convert it over to a stateless functional component. What do we know so far? We know that our React components can be functions, or they can be classes that extend React.component. We're going to continue looking at more component features in the next one, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.